Great. Welcome and thanks for joining us. And I hope and I trust that you can see and hear us. This is the first of 7 events of our series, Envisioning a Livable Future, which we've organized to mark the 10th anniversary of Pope Francis's groundbreaking encyclical Laudato Si on care for our common home. And by the way, in case you don't know the terminology, an encyclical is a letter that the Pope sends to all other bishops in the Roman Catholic Church, though Francis addressed Laudato Si to every person living on this planet. We have 3 goals for this series, which will span this winter, spring, and fall. First, to raise ecological consciousness. Second, to draw attention to climate-forward initiatives. And third, to encourage personal discernment and social action. Thanks again for joining us. My name is Bernard Prusak, and I hold the Raymond and Eleanor Smiley Chair in Business Ethics at John Carroll University, which is a Jesuit university in the greater Cleveland area in the United States. John Carroll is hosting this series in collaboration with the Hank Center for the Catholic Intellectual Heritage at Loyola University Chicago, and I thank the Hank Center's director, Michael Murphy, for his partnership. I also thank my colleagues at John Carroll who have helped make this series possible, especially, though not only, the members of the organizing committee and my principal collaborator in this project, Sister Catherine Feely, who directs John Carroll's excellent Center for Service Learning and Social Action.
As all of you know who have joined us tonight, our topic this evening is the current state of climate science. We're beginning, as Pope Francis does in Laudato Si, with a survey of what is happening to our common home. Our questions include not only what is happening, but are we too late? Can we bend the curve even now? And what has changed since 2015? Further, we want to probe what needs to be done by when and how do we do it together. We have several extraordinary speakers to help us think through these questions, and we thank them for being here. I'll introduce each speaker briefly. Catherine Hayhoe is an atmospheric scientist whose research focuses on climate change. She's the chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy and a distinguished professor and endowed chair at Texas Tech University. Catherine is the author of multiple books. One of her TED Talks has been viewed more than 4 million times, and there's so much more to say about her. After this event, you should Google her to learn more about all that she's doing. Ben Sovacool is the director of the Boston University Institute for Global Sustainability and a professor in BU's Department of Earth and Environment. You'll need to Google him too. He was a lead author of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 6th Assessment Report, published in 2022. He is one of the most highly cited global researchers on issues bearing the controversies in energy and climate policy. To boot, he's an alumnus of John Carroll, and we're very proud to call him one of our own. Nancy Tuckman is a professor of biology and the founding dean of the Loyola University of Chicago School of Sustainability. Her leadership in environmental sustainability has put Loyola Chicago in the top 5% of greenest colleges in the United States. And if you Google her, you can learn about the many ways she has been a major driver of environmental progress in the Chicago area over her diverse and distinguished career.
Thanks again to each of you for joining us. So here's the structure for our 75 minutes together. Catherine Hayhoe, Ben, and Nancy each will speak for about 10 minutes. After each presentation, they'll engage one another for 5 minutes or so, and that will take us to around 50 minutes. At that point, we'll turn to Q&A from you, and I see there's already a question in the Q&A. So please put your questions in the Q&A box there at the bottom of the screen. Sister Catherine and I will do our best to introduce your questions into the mix, though you're going to have to forgive us. I doubt we'll be able to ask each and every question. Likely we'll mash some of your questions together. We'll do our best. So without further ado, thanks everybody for being here, and thanks to our speakers. Catherine, you want to take it away?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Bernard. It is great to be here with you. Thank you, everyone, for showing up. This is being recorded, so you can share it afterwards. And I'm just so delighted to be able to share this time with you, with Ben, and with Nancy. I think that what we have to say complements each other perfectly. So as a climate scientist, I'm going to begin with the topic of this episode, the very first conference session. Let me go ahead and share my screen with you. Here we go. And this session is titled The Current State of Climate Science. And on the website, it asks several questions. And one of the questions, the one I want to start with is, what has changed since 2015? This is the 10th anniversary of Laudato Si. What has changed since then? I actually want to begin with what has not changed. The basic science of climate change, understanding that when we dig up and burn coal and gas and oil, it produces heat-trapping gases that build up in the atmosphere, wrapping an extra blanket around the planet. That has been known since the work of Fourier, Tyndall, and Foote in the 1850s. By the 1890s, Svante Arrhenius, who was a Swedish chemist and a distant cousin of Greta Thunberg's, it turns out too, he calculated by hand how much the Earth would warm if we doubled or tripled levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The very first climate model calculated by hand in the 1890s. And by the 1930s, Guy Callender, a British engineer, actually detected the warming of the planet in thermometer data. So we have known, we have been able to model, and we've even been able to measure human-caused warming for, in many cases, over a century. And the science itself is really simple. Our planet has a natural blanket of heat-trapping gases. The sun's energy shines down, and most of it goes right through this blanket and warms up the Earth. As the Earth heats up, it gives off heat energy, and just like a blanket traps your body heat on a cold night, this natural blanket of the Earth traps the Earth's heat, keeping us much warmer than we would be otherwise. We would be a frozen ball of ice if it were not for this amazing natural blanket. So what's the problem? The problem is, by digging up and burning coal and gas and oil, that's about 75% of the problem. And then through deforestation and unsustainable agriculture, that's 25% of the problem. We are producing more and more of these heat-trapping gases. And as they build up in the atmosphere, they're wrapping an extra blanket around the planet, causing it to warm. That is what's happening. It is so simple that you can explain it in 30 seconds with a cartoon. We've also known, and we knew this back in 2015, that although many people call what's happening global warming, the way you and I are experiencing this ourselves, where we live in our lives, is more like global weirding. In other words, wherever we live, it's as if we have this pair of weather dice, and we always have a chance of rolling a double six naturally, a heat wave, a drought, a flood, a wildfire. But as the world gets warmer, decade by decade, it's like climate change is sneaking in and replacing one of these numbers with another six, and another one, and then even a seven. And then we're saying, how did LA have these wildfires in January? How did we have not one, but two incredibly strong damaging hurricanes, Helene and Milton, back to back? How did this happen? It's because climate change is loading the weather dice against us. And what we have learned in the last 10 years is that we can now, today, which we couldn't 15 years ago, we can now put a number on how much hotter the heat wave is because of climate change, on how much more area has been burned because of the emissions of specific companies. 37% of the area burned across Western North America in the last few decades was because of the carbon emissions from only 88 companies. We can put numbers on how much stronger and longer a drought is. We can calculate how much more rain fell during a hurricane, how many more houses were flooded, how much greater the economic damages were, because of climate change for a single hurricane, or a single atmospheric river, or a heavy rainfall event. We can actually put a number on the human fingerprint, and that is one of the biggest advances in climate science over the last 10 years. We know now that in the US, there was $1 billion weather and climate disaster on average once every 4 months in the 1980s. In the 2010s, there was one every 2.8 weeks when Laudato Si came out, and now there's one at least every 2 weeks on average. So the next question that people often ask is, does this mean it's too late? And here also, the science has a very clear answer, an answer that was written after Laudato Si came out. The science, as summarized by the IPCC, says every action matters. Every bit of warming matters. Every year matters, and every choice matters. It's as if we've been smoking a pack of cigarettes every day for a decade or more. We have some lung damage. We have some spots on our lungs. We're not going to win the Olympics anymore, but we don't have emphysema. We don't have lung cancer, and we're not dead yet. So when's the best time to stop smoking? As soon as possible. How much? As much as possible. Every action matters. Every bit of warming matters. We know today, too, in a way that we didn't even 10 years ago, that the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, the buildings and roads and systems that we use, and the nature that surrounds us, it's all being impacted by climate change today. We can see this happening with our eyes. It is not about saving the planet. The planet itself will be orbiting the sun long after we're gone. This is literally about saving us humans. Whoever we are being impacted by climate change today. So the last question that we're asking, and we will all be answering, is what needs to be done, by when, and how? And this is really important because, I want to speak directly to you about this now, there is no silver bullet. There is no one thing that if everybody did this one thing, that would be it. But the good news is there's a lot of silver buckshot. A lot of things that we can do. Ben is an expert in that. Nancy's going to talk about what the Catholic universities are doing right here in the US. There's so much that we can do to make a difference. And every single one of us has a role to play. So I want to end with reminding you that when we talk about the how, we often immediately jump to our personal carbon footprints. And believe me, we all of us, we think about our personal carbon footprints a lot. In fact, this is part of the reason why I do so many of my events virtually, because the biggest part of my personal carbon footprint, it turned out, when I stepped on the carbon calculator 10 years ago, was flying to climate science conferences and to give talks on climate change, which is a little ironic. So I've transitioned most of the things I do to virtual, but I know that that's not enough. And so what I have done the last 10 years that I didn't do before that is I have done a deep dive into the social science of how. How does the social science tell us that we as individuals can affect change? And when we look at the social science, it is really powerful and really fascinating. It tells us that there's a lot that we can do, but it's a little bit counterintuitive. And so let me put this back up one more time, because I have a list I want to share with you about how. And this list is about us as individuals. How can we as individuals make a difference? So as individuals, this is the list that if you go to my Instagram account or my Threads account or my Blue Sky account, you will see this pinned to the top, because this is the most important thing I think each one of us needs to know. If we're worried about climate change and we want to make a difference, and did you know that 2/3 of the people in the US are already worried about climate change, but only 8% are activated because they don't know what to do? 60% of people are worried but not activated because they don't know what to do. According to the social science, the most important things we can do are to have a conversation about why it matters, because people aren't talking about why it matters. Join together with other people to share this news about why it matters. Consider where we keep our money. use our voice to spark ideas for change at work, at school, hold politicians accountable. And I'm not only talking about the federal government, I'm talking about states, cities, counties, school boards, and more. And then take personal action and make our actions contagious by talking about it. As Bill McKibben says, the most important thing an individual can do right now is not be such an individual. And I feel like, as people of faith, that's a message that we have. The image that we have of the church is a body where everybody has a different role to play in that body. And just, the hand is not in any way inferior to the nervous system or the liver. That's what we need for climate change. We need all the different parts of the body coming together, working together in community, because history shows that when people come together, change can happen. So that, to me, is my how. Thank you.
Thanks. And we've got some really interesting questions, goodness, in the Q&A. So Nancy and Ben, do you want to enter the conversation?
My pleasure, and I get to follow with these beautiful slime green slides, which are meant to mimic a leaf. Thanks to our communications director for that. But it's a real pleasure to follow Catherine, and I want to kind of talk today about just two things: the importance of technology, and the fact that we actually already have a lot of the technologies we need to fully address climate change. We actually have had them for 2 decades. Climate stabilization wedges, right? Pakala Sokolo wrote that paper 20 years ago. So it's a mistake that we don't have the technologies, which makes it a political and ethical problem. And secondly, I want to talk exactly what Catherine talked about. What are some of the behavioral actions that we could take even today, even tonight, to actually start to lower our carbon footprints and create a more sustainable world? So first, Bernard did mention that I got to help the IPCC, makes a great Scrabble word, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, with their 2022 report. And this is in the summary for policymakers, if you want to sound cool, the SPM. And it really shows you all of the options commercially available 3 years ago that we had at scale to mitigate emissions across different forms of energy supply: wind, solar, nuclear, bioenergy, reducing methane. AFOLU is a fancy word for forestry and land use change. We could do better land management practices, better agriculture, reducing food waste. All of these options in buildings, look around where you are right now: lights, windows, insulation, retrofits, energy audits, maybe making more wood with how we build. And then a whole variety of options across transportation and industry, and also reducing other sectors of the economy, because climate change, interestingly, isn't just about carbon dioxide. It's also methane and nitrous oxide and some of these fluorinated gases. What's interesting about this graph, it's a bit busy because the IPCC is synthesizing hundreds of studies. The width of these bars gives you the gigatons, the billion tons of CO2 that you can displace. So the bigger the bar, the more potential it has to lower emissions globally. And it's really neat that you can see already wind, solar, carbon in agriculture, and better ecosystem management and forests are the kind of big four. But you also see these colors. And the colors are meant, everywhere you see blue, it's cost effective. It actually has so many co-benefits. It actually pays you to lower carbon while you're also building resilience, diversifying the economy, doing fuel savings, and so forth. So one way of looking at this is do the biggest options. Another way is do the most effective options in blue, and then maybe use those to pay for the options that are in yellow or red, leading us to net zero. But what's amazing is the scientific evidence is clear. If you add up all of those bars of emissions reductions, you almost get to net zero just with commercially available technologies on this matrix. What's also interesting is what is not here. We don't see a lot of the future options like algal fuel or small modular reactors or fusion even on this list because they're too far away. And we don't even need them necessarily. We have all of the options now. But it's really easy to obsess over technology and not actually go beyond techno-economic fixes. So I also want to talk about how we can decarbonize, how we can get carbon out of our economies and societies and lifestyles with behavior. And 20 years ago, you would never have seen this in any of these assessments. And now even the International Energy Agency is talking about the sheer large emissions reductions that we can get from doing things like how we do our laundry and how we drive our cars and whether we lower our air conditioning use, or whether we maybe perhaps wash our clothes in cold water or line dry. And these things can already get up to about 2 billion tons of avoided carbon dioxide, which is a huge amount. That is an amount similar, I think, to current data center consumption or similar emissions from aviation and freight, depending on how you do the accounting. And I really love this diagram. It's also very busy, but it's from a wonderful resource I urge you to get. I put the link on the slide. It's free. It's from the UN. It is called Kick the Habit, a guide to a low carbon lifestyle. And what they did here for an ordinary student in Germany, they tracked 2 people for 24 hours that day. The first person in that ugly yellow hash color was low carbon, and the second person in red was high carbon. And they went through everything they did, from waking up with an alarm clock, to drying their hair, to turning off their Wi-Fi, to how they had their lunch. And it turns out you can have a carbon footprint that is only 14 kilograms compared to almost 40 kilograms. So almost a factor of 3, not by giving up things, just being smart with how you do things. Maybe avoid that strawberry snack imported from Africa and instead have something local. Maybe really think through how long you shower and how hot the shower is and whether you wash your clothes in hot or cold water. So we're not saying go without cold beer and Wi-Fi and Netflix and clean clothes. Just be more conscious with how you choose those things, and you can have a huge impact on your carbon footprints. Now for the more complex slide. I was a wonderful co-investigator of a European project called HOPE. Household Preferences for Energy. HOPE was a wonderful project in 4 high-income, cold climate European countries: Germany, France, Norway, Sweden. And what was amazing about this project, there were 30 of us involved. We did an experimental design where we actually worked with hundreds of households, to get them to lower their carbon footprint over 2 years. And to belie the complexity of options these households had, there were 66. That's why this is so busy. 66 options households could do across food, changing their buildings, transportation, and then other, which includes things like shopping and luxuries and vacations. And what was amazing is we worked with these households for 2 years, and in the end, they voluntarily reduced their footprint by an average of 50%, which is great, without money, without coercion, just by giving them information and showing them what to do. You can see here, everything above that 50% mark are more than 50% of households recycled more, did eco-driving, changed their electricity provider, bought more energy efficient devices. And then in the bottom right, less frequent actions that were still really impactful, giving up their car, or like Catherine, really trying to minimize their intercontinental flights. And I think that was amazing that we confirmed across these households these significance of voluntary carbon reductions. Now, of course, 66 options is a lot. So I wanted to end with just 4 options. So what are 4 simple changes you could do tonight? First of all, consume less and repair, right? We overconsume. We've been habituated to overconsume, especially in North America. Look at this statistic. Our global culture will consume now more in the past 6 years than all of humanity consumed for all of the 20th century, which then makes repairing, recycling, reusing, and better cradle-to-cradle designs a radical act. And that's why, Bernard, I do have a sports jacket, but I decided to wear Patagonia because we had these specially made out of recycled microfibers, because repairing and extending the life of things is a radical act. My shirt used to be recycled water bottles. And I really support the company Patagonia because they do their part to try to minimize waste and also extend the lifetime of their products. So that's the first thing you can do. Don't throw away the pair of socks that has tears. Sew them up. Don't get rid of the trousers that are damaged. Maybe patch them and start to get in of a mentality of how long can I use what I already have. Secondly, walk or cycle, or if you can, in rural areas, maybe ride share, car share, bike share, right? I love this notion that look at all of the pros where we start to do more active, non-autocentric mobility, reduced injuries, better health, lower pollution, safety, etc. I still remember my first dog and cat were both run over by cars, right? And the Dutch and others in Europe have done this very well. In the Netherlands, right, they've invested $600 million on biking, but they have 20 billion saved and just avoided health costs alone. So low carbon mobility is not just a free lunch, it's a free lunch you get paid to eat. And I love these numbers here on the right about every time you walk, you're only having a social cost of about a cent. But every time you drive, it costs you 9.2 times that in roads and pollution and dust and noise and traffic jams and so forth. Third simple change, diet. I struggle with this because I love beef, I love cheese, I love beer, and I love coffee, and they are all on this diagram as carbon-intensive forms of food. What should we be eating instead? When you talk about the entire life cycle of the supply chain of food, so land use changes, farming, processing, transportation, refrigeration, packaging, well, nuts, fruit, vegetables, corn, and maybe up to milk and fish. Also, the location of where you get your food from really matters, right? Don't get those organic strawberries from South Africa when you're living in the middle of Cleveland or University Heights. And then lastly, I have to really mention empowering young girls and young women. My colleague Jin In has written this book called Girl Power, and you would be amazed currently at how patriarchal and sexist our society still is in 2025. In 2025, a girl is still forced to marry every 2 seconds, and 1 out of 10 young women face the threat of rape and sexual assault. Which means, when you take some data from Project Drawdown, one of the biggest wedges, that's the little pizza slice I made there, of carbon emissions reductions is not nuclear power or wind or solar, but better education of young women and better reproductive freedom and choices for young women, and also better skills training for women in agriculture, forestry, fishing, and so forth. So we really can start to solve climate change with things as simple as walking, educating young children, changing what we eat, and also thinking through how we prolong what we have. And my last slide is, as problematic as it is to wait for someone else to save us, and so I really love this quote from Robert Swan, that the greatest threat to our planet is the belief that someone else, government, industry, Elon Musk, Donald Trump, will save it. I'm also really inspired by this wonderful quote from Anne Frank, who survived the Holocaust only to say, how wonderful it is that no one has to wait. You can start right now to change the world. Thank you.
Thanks. And I wonder if Nancy or Catherine, you'd want to respond now or up to you.
Well, I love, and I just wanted to highlight how we often immediately think of some of the things Ben mentioned, like where do we get our electricity from, or how do we transport ourselves around? Increasingly, people are starting to realize that what we eat plays a big role, but it's not just about our personal carbon footprint, it's also about our climate shadow. How do we affect people around us? And so I love that he mentioned my personal favorite solution, which is empowering women and girls. We always get a question, in fact, we already got a question tonight on, isn't it just an overpopulation issue that we have too many people? Well, the richest 1% in the world produce more than double the carbon emissions of the poorest 50%. So if in the Thanos, there's Avengers movie where there's this big purple guy who has this glove and he snaps his fingers and half the people in the universe disappear. If they were the poorest people who disappeared, it wouldn't affect climate change. Those are the people who most are impacted by climate change, who most bear the brunt of the impacts that they did not cause. And empowering women and girls addresses so many issues in addition to climate change. Like the climate benefits are like the icing on the cake in terms of equity, justice, love, mercy, compassion, and all of the other virtues that we often so much talk about in our faith. So I love that there's climate solutions that have the win-win-wins, like it's a win for your health and climate. It's a win for your pocketbook and climate. It's a win for the poorest and the least of these and for climate too. And so these multiple wins mean that so many more people can get involved. And so Ben, I love that you always pointed out all the multiple wins.
And let me just say, the one thing I really didn't touch upon was kind of spirituality and faith and service. And that is, I know, something that the Jesuits did teach me at John Carroll, and I think that might be really nice to hear what Nancy is going to say, because I think there's also a role there, because we think of it as a technical problem or a scientific problem, but it is also a spiritual problem. Nancy, that's your setup.
Thank you, Ben and Catherine. It's really fun to be with all of you tonight, and it's fun to kind of follow up after both Catherine and Ben gave their presentation. So let me share screen. And what I'm going to talk about is some wins that we have seen and give you some examples of case studies where people have made good headway and continue to make good headway, despite who's the president of the United States and what direction they're going with climate change. There are still some really good things happening, and I want to share that with you. So because we are a Jesuit university, and we do have Pope Francis, who is a world leader, obviously, and he wrote this encyclical, Laudato Si, 10 years ago now. It's really a beautiful piece to read, but what it's done in terms of encouraging us to he's made a call for action, really encouraging us to put what we understand from the science, what we know from ourselves as social beings who have to oftentimes be prodded to affect change in our own behaviors. He's calling us to action. And frankly, in this second piece that he wrote, Laudate Deum, he's kind of poking us right in the eyes, saying, okay, you all liked Laudato Si, you all read it, you talked about it a lot of times, and you had a bunch of conferences about Laudato Si, but I don't see much action. I really don't see very many people moving this into action. And so I really like Laudate Deum as much as Laudato Si because I think it really does goose us into action. Another really good call to action is coming from the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits order of Catholic priests, and they kind of set up their own strategic plan, if you will, that has these 4 major goals or universal apostolic preferences. And you can see how in Catholic and Jesuit universities, all 4 of these things are being attended to. But you see that he puts caring for our common home, which means caring for nature, for the earth, for planet, for creation, is one of the top issues among the Jesuits. So these are 2, in my way of thinking, really big organizations that are trying to call us all to action to get us to do more. This is an interesting piece. In 2020, Amnesty International did a survey of Gen Z aged people in 198 different countries around the world, and they asked those Gen Z people, what is the most important issue facing the world and facing your country? I know these are really hard to read, so I'll just tell you what the top 4 are. They're listed over here. The number 1 issue on the minds of Gen Z is climate change. The number 2 issue is pollution, and then comes terrorism, and then is loss of natural resources. So 3 of the 4 top issues on the minds of the students that come into our universities are about the degradation of the environment. And this is really, aligns directly with Laudato Si and the call for action. So let me share with you a case study at the university where I am, Loyola University, Chicago. We started responding to the global environmental crisis 23 years ago. This is a long game, and it's not something that you put effort into for 1 year or 2 years, and then you can say, okay, I did my bit. This is a change of culture that takes many years and lots of investment, and you have to kind of keep pushing, and you can't let up on really making progress. So at Loyola University, we made a pledge 23 years ago with our then president, who said, okay, we're going to ultimately build a school of environmental sustainability. And so we're going to be doing this work through the education side of what we do, but we're also going to do the work. We're going to walk the walk by reducing our environmental footprint of all of our campuses. We have 5 different campuses here. So here is an example of some of the milestone and achievements that this university has made over that 23 years of investment and work to reduce our environmental footprint. It's doable. And, we started doing this work before there was a lot of knowledge about, we didn't have very good solar panels back 23 years ago. They weren't very efficient. There weren't a lot of technological solutions. And so now the technology, as Ben demonstrated, is so much more readily available. It's almost easier to do now than it was when we started. But we still made terrific progress. We are now carbon neutral. We were able to reduce our greenhouse gas emission by 45% just by making our buildings more energy efficient, working on the envelopes of every building, tearing down old buildings that were super old and energy inefficient, replacing them with LEED certified buildings. And then we were able to reduce our greenhouse gas emission by an additional 40% by signing a power purchase agreement with the state of Illinois' biggest solar panel company and array, which is in central Illinois. And so we're down to 15% of the greenhouse gas emission that we started with when we did our baseline. So we're now paying for offsets for that 15%, but we're also in the process of building our next climate action plan, which takes us from carbon neutrality to being decarbonized, so that we don't put a single molecule of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere with the typical work that we're doing on our campus. So it's very doable. This is an inspiring university to be working at, because the whole university is behind this and has made this pledge. And what do we see? We see that 50% of the incoming freshmen at Loyola University tell us the reason why they picked Loyola rather than other universities that they got accepted to is that our commitment to the environment is important or very important to their decision to come. So this matters to Gen Z. It matters to our incoming freshmen, and they pick Loyola because we walk the walk. So that's important, and it's a good way to leverage your universities to do this work. I don't need to show you all the different offerings that we have, but basically the School of Environmental Sustainability is big, it's robust, it attracts students. And we've gone, from 0 to 500 students as a school in the last 5 years. And so it really is attracting students. And, our goal is to prepare climate leaders. We've had a lot of luck working directly with facilities in their long-term plans of, making the campus more sustainable. They've worked with us to integrate infrastructure into the work that we do with students. And so we have students, we do a lot of programming around food systems and sustainable agriculture, and we can use our campus as a laboratory. The same thing with converting our waste vegetable oil from all the deep fat fryers in our cafeterias into biodiesel that's then used in the shuttle buses that go between our campuses. So another way to show how to reduce your waste and how to reduce your consumption of fossil fuels. And these are all ways that really energize students and mobilize them and empower them to make a difference. We do quite a bit of heating and cooling on our campuses using geothermal, which in our part of the world, which has quite cold winters and pretty hot summers, we do a lot of heating and cooling. These systems are incredibly efficient, and the return on investment is super high. And so, think about this with your own campuses and industries. And then again, the perpetual goal of becoming a zero waste university, which is a very ambitious goal and hard to do, but so much of it is about behavior, right? It kind of goes back to just making decisions, making good choices, like Catherine and Ben have already discussed. Okay, finally, I just want to tell you that we met carbon neutrality, but now people are getting so much more aware of our own carbon impact that they're saying, well, let's keep going. Let's decarbonize. Let's get STAR's platinum rating, and let's try to do that by next year. And let's become a zero waste campus. So our next climate action plan, which is a 10-year plan, we just finished the first 10-year plan from 2015 to 2025. Our next one is to decarbonize the university. It's super ambitious, but it's also really exciting, and it's a fun way to move forward. And I'll also say that at the high levels of the network of Jesuit universities around the world, and by the way, the Jesuits kind of have the claim on the largest number of and network of higher education on the planet, with over 200 Jesuit universities, and also the highest secondary ed network on the planet, with over 2,500 high schools in all regions of the world. Their goal, the collective goal, is to be the higher ed and secondary ed network that's leading in environmental sustainability. Thank you, Pope Francis, for planting the seed and for calling everybody to action, because I think this idea of working in numbers and not being isolated is super empowering and really important. So I'm really just kind of reinforcing what Catherine and Ben have already said. Outside of Loyola, are there other places where we find wins for the environment, especially in the wind of the current administration in Washington, D.C., pulling us out of the Paris Accord? I saw several questions in the chat that people were saying, well, what's going to happen now? Now that we're not in the Paris Accord, and many of these issues and a lot of the money that was coming, from Biden's administration, it looks like now it might be pulled back. So we have to keep moving forward. We have to do it as a grassroots effort where individuals, families, organizations, villages, cities, all the way up to the state level, are pushing in the same direction to fight climate change, reduce our consumption and waste, and reduce environmental impact. So these are just some examples of organizations that are really making good headway. And I just pulled a few out. I could have put 80 of these things. I probably could have put hundreds of them, on this slide. But again, because I'm from Chicago, and I'm really proud of what the city and the state is doing, I'm going to use Chicago and Illinois as a case study, but we're not doing half as much as places like Colorado and California. So keep in mind that there are a lot of wins that we can look to. So in the city of Chicago, we have a pretty ambitious carbon action plan to decarbonize all of our buildings. And that's going to happen by 2050, but to hit 100% renewable by 2030. That's a super ambitious goal, because that's right around the corner. And there's a lot of work going on with water quality, air pollution, natural resource management, and energy. We're working with the grid. We're working with all of the businesses and industries in Chicago, and we're working terrific work going on in the BIPOC communities that are underserved. So these are just a few of the organizations, but there are many, many more that are contributing to this movement in Chicago, and it's exciting to live here because it's a cool city. And I'm pretty proud of J.B. Pritzker, who passed the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, CEJA, which is really becoming pretty famous around the country, and it's being used by many other states that are trying to do a similar thing. It's the most equitable bill for clean energy in the nation. It's very ambitious. It really promotes a just transition from a fossil fuel-based economy to a clean energy economy. And Illinois has really made huge strides. I mentioned that Loyola made a power purchase agreement with this big solar company. That company, which has over 1.6 million solar panels on the entire array, is the largest solar company east of the Mississippi River. Okay, we don't get as much sun as the countries or the states that are on the west of the Mississippi River, but we still have this enormous solar company that is now really distributing solar power, throughout the state. In addition, the state of Illinois has developed this coalition called the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition. It's a bundle of legislation that comes at climate change from lots of different angles, from transportation to BIPOC communities, looking at ways that we, build our buildings and design our buildings. There's tons of little bits of legislation that all come together to accelerate Illinois' progress towards, making this just transition. So it's really exciting. And then finally, I want to say America is All In is an organization, the largest coalition of climate leaders in the US, with over 500 organizations that are now members. These members, and Loyola Chicago is one of them, and the city of Chicago is another, are all making their commitments to double down on their goals, which meet the Paris Agreement. So if you look at who are members, it includes cities and states, tribal nations, businesses, universities, faith groups. It goes through just about every piece, every sector of the economy. It includes membership. In total, it represents 50 states in the country, 63% of the US population, and that's because you're adding all the members from those towns and cities and tribal nations. It adds up to 63% of our population and 75% of the US gross domestic product. That puts us, this group is the third largest in the world. Second to China and the US comes this group, this portion of the US that is still in the climate accord. So that's pretty exciting. If you're not a member, or if your city's not a member, get on it and really try to get them to think about becoming a member, because what you can do, and sort of taking off Catherine, I'll start with what you shouldn't do. Do not give up. Do not say, I'm moving to Canada, because we need all hands on deck. And do not jump off the ship when we think the ship is sinking. That's not right. Do not completely unplug from the news. Keep at least abreast of what's happening, and then fight back. Don't just complain and say this sucks and it's terrible, and we just have to hunker down and wait till the wind blows over. You have to move your concerns into action. So it's about civic duty. It's about be a good American and care for our country, for our people, care for the world. And I would say one of the most important things to do, and Catherine, I think this was your number one on your list, join an organization that's already established. Don't go try and be a climate hero and start your own organization, because literally that just kind of dilutes the effort. If we can work together and build our effort in some of these really well-established, really organizations that are making really terrific headway, that's the best way that you can contribute. And then lead your own household, lead your personal environmental footprint, think about your choices, and move into some of those actions that Catherine and Ben talked about. Lead your place of employment, or your school, or your place of worship. Move into leadership, move into action, take your concerns to action. And that's really what I think we all need to do. It's time for us to all get off our seats and move. So that's my spiel. Thank you.
I love that, Nancy, because just in case anybody doesn't know, I am Canadian and I'm not moving to Canada. So if I'm not moving, then nobody else has an excuse. We got to fix things here. And of course, I'm fighting for climate action in Canada too. But the US has such an outsized impact, and not just the US as a country, the cities within the US and the states too, like Illinois, Chicago, even where I live in Texas, change is happening.
Thank you very much, all three of you. We have now 42 questions in the Q&A, and there are a lot of really good questions. There's no way we're going to be able to answer 42 questions in 25 minutes, but we have some work to do. So I thought I might just observe first, a number of the questions refer to our current political climate. Several questions have to do with how to respond to climate skeptics. So maybe we could speak a little bit about this. There's one question that I think there are a number of really good questions, but one is very well put on this point. And so I'm going to read it. Like many others, climate change seems to be the problem facing the globe. A problem, if not solved, renders other global problems insignificant by comparison. But the barriers to solving this problem seem like they may be the second biggest problem facing the globe. So I thought that was really an interesting formulation. So I wonder if you might talk a little bit, thinking about our current political climate. Nancy, you've already spoken about that just now, really. But I wonder if you might, think a little bit about how to respond to climate skeptics, and then speak in particular to that observation. Biggest problem, climate change. Second biggest problem, solving this problem.
I'll take the skeptics first, and then I would love
Great.
to hear what Ben and Nancy have to say about the other questions. So often when I tell people that one of the most important things we can do about climate change is talk about it, people think immediately I mean to run out and collar Uncle Joe. Load up on all the sciencey facts and just show Uncle Joe he's wrong. And I don't mean Joe specifically. I just mean the person in your life, who is always posting on Facebook about how climate change isn't real and electric vehicles cause cancer and it's all caused by volcanoes anyways. Well, here's the thing. Those people's voices are very loud and very persistent, but they only represent a tiny fraction of the population. In fact, let me show you the numbers. I have the numbers here. People who are truly dismissive are only 11% of the population. And my definition of someone who's dismissive is an angel from God with brand new tablets of stone saying global warming is real would not be enough to convince them. And so if that's not enough, then who do we think we are? So when I say to have conversations, I do not mean to have conversations with the people who are just absolutely obsessed with the idea that this isn't real and they talk about it all the time. They are loud, but they're only a fraction of the population. 90% of people are not dismissive. And only a tiny number of us are actually having conversations. Remember what I said? 2/3 of people are worried, but what percent are activated? 8%. So isn't it more important to talk to the almost 60% of people who are worried, but they're not activated? Because they're already worried, but they don't know why it matters and they don't know what to do. So with people who are dismissive, my approach is simply to say, I'm sorry, you're wrong. And now let's talk about something else. Because arguing with them actually strengthens them. It reinforces it. But when we're talking about something else, I can certainly slide in how, China is really beating the pants off the US when it comes to clean energy. Are you okay with that, Uncle Joe? Or, wow, I love how much money I saved with my plug-in car. Gas prices are really high now, but you wouldn't believe what my power bill looked like last month. It was so low. So you can certainly slide in these benefits that address the real problem of solution aversion. But going head to head with someone who's dismissive is not going to yield results. And frankly, we don't need it to. Most people are worried, but they don't know what to do. So if we focus our conversations on that group, we truly can catalyze the change we need.
Thanks. Do others want to say more to that, or should we go on to the next?
I just want to say I'm really glad to hear you say that, Catherine, because that's my answer too. I don't think we need to convince every person on the planet. It is an obstacle, but there's so much more opportunity with the people who want to engage, that it's a better use of time and energy, and we'll get there faster. It'll be more accelerated working with the people who are engaged.
Great. Let's move on. So this is a constructively critical question, and maybe it's directed toward you, Ben. I don't know. So isn't it something of a red herring to focus on carbon footprint, since so much of the problem is structural and therefore has to be addressed through the political process? This person is thinking of how BP, the oil company, coined the term carbon footprint. They'd be only too happy if we frame the problem this way. And then the question is, isn't that true? Let me just mush that with one other question too. Just one other question. There are a few actually people who speak to that. But the other question, kind of a little bit of a broader question, just comes from our watch party here on John Carroll's campus. How can I be a leader in my community? So on the one hand, sort of red herring to focus on carbon footprint. On the other hand, how can I be a leader?
So, no, it's not a red herring to talk about carbon footprint, and in a way, it's probably one of the few ways that we can actually claim some of our responsibility. Here's another statistic for you. Depending on how you do your emissions counting, 72% of emissions are related to our consumption as individuals, right? So, in that way, and there's even colleagues of ours like Michael P. Vandenberg that even talks about how a focus on individuals and their footprints is probably the most effective way of reducing carbon, because unlike a corporation, we can actually do it. We're not fiduciarily bound to make profit and do a bunch of other things. So I think there's also, though, to give some legitimacy to that point, there's a classic debate in the social sciences about agency and structure. Do you try to target individuals and empower us so that we can act collectively, individually, or through institutions, or are we really constrained by these macro social structures like the economy, political systems, and so forth? And I think they're recursive. Agency can shape structure, structure can shape agency. And there's still a lot that you can do as an individual, even if you are not caring about your carbon footprint, to still do these other leverage points for change, like having discussions with your city planners and your state senators and going to DC and doing all sorts of things there. So I think that, I wouldn't say if we only focus on carbon footprints, we've done it, but I don't think we should not. And I don't think it's a red herring at all. The final thing too is that lifestyle changes have something that policy change and systemic change do not, and that is rapidity and granularity. We can start them now. We don't have to wait for Congress to debate, ratify, etc. It takes between 5 and 7 years to introduce lots of new standards and regulations. It takes an hour to potentially change your behavior. Which is why doing things like changing your diet has a more immediate effect. Stop driving your car, stop flying airplanes can affect the climate tomorrow, rather than waiting 5 years for legislation. So that's my own personal take. It dovetails nicely to the second part of the question, what can you do to be a good community leader? Apart from lowering your carbon footprint, I am a really big fan of Martin Luther King Jr., and I remember reading the speech when he won the Nobel Prize in 1964. He kind of talked about how any successful campaign to change society has 4 steps. First, collect the facts of injustice so you can evidence them. And I think we've given you lots today to do that. The second thing he said is negotiate. Start to have those conversations, just like Catherine said, with family members, with community members, what was it, Uncle Joe, with other dissenters. Third, and actually this connects to carbon footprints, self-purification. How can you yourself be more pure, virtuous, and moral when it comes to carbon? And then finally, and perhaps what he is most known for, is nonviolent direct action. After you do those first 3 things, take to the streets, boycott, protest, sit-ins, march, sing, and so forth. And I think that's what all of us, Dr. King was an individual, from Boston University, by the way, but he was an individual. And I think he's given us a pathway with those 4 steps of what you could do in your communities.
Thanks. Hey, Sister Catherine, did you want to enter here? Do you have any questions you want to pull out?
There was a really interesting comment, and it goes like this. I used to think that the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change, but I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those issues, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And we as scientists might need more assistance in doing that. It dovetails with the question that was just raised, but I was wondering if you could also speak to how do we take up that charge of advocacy? And there's a question here about using various mediums, including music. What are ways that we can help people think beyond just cause and effect, but also look at the human connection and sustainability within what we can do?
I just want to add one thing, Sister Catherine. I'm going to impress maybe some of you. I've also been reading Sister Joan Chittister, and she would add narcissism as another layer of that. Self-love, right, at the expense of everything else. And you're right. How do we go beyond this kind of destructive, really damaging, careless, narcissistic culture? I don't know, but I thought I would throw that out there. Catherine, have you got something to say?
Yeah, I was going to say, thanks, Ben.
I'm nodding along. So that quote that you read, Sister Catherine, is from Gus Speth, who is a very famous scientist who wrote and spoke and advocated for many years on climate action. And I love the fact that he points out that these are what we see are symptoms. So the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, the pollution crisis. We haven't even touched on how just the air pollution from fossil fuels alone kills almost 9 million people a year. The inequity crisis that has grown due to COVID and is continuing to grow due to climate change, they are all come from the same roots. And the same roots are the attitudes that we bring to our shared home and to each other, our sisters and our brothers. And that's why I think Laudato Si and Laudato Deum are so, so powerful, because in it, Pope Francis speaks directly to the roots. He speaks to our attitudes, to our perspectives, to our values, and to our morals. And the social science actually looks at what are the tipping points in society that could really accelerate climate action. And one of the biggest tipping points is to make the moral case for change, not the economic case. Making the economic case for change is not a societal tipping point. Even though we hear people every day saying that, oh, we have to just make the economic case. I'm sorry, but right now we already have the economic case. And yet, where I stand in Texas, people are charging ahead on fossil fuels when solar and wind energy is cheaper and creates more jobs right here in the state. It's not about the economic case being the accelerator, the moral case, the values. And that's what faith brings to the conversation. I feel like it can make that moral case so effectively and so authoritatively. And that's what Pope Francis did so powerfully. I mean, I remember I was reading Laudato Deum on my phone. I thought my phone was going to burst into flames at some point. It was that powerful. And let me tell you, I never felt that way about an IPCC report.
Thank you. So many questions and some really provocative questions and also comments in the Q&A. I want to throw together, though, several of the questions. So a number of people have asked about AI and data centers. There are also a number of people who have asked about the use of nuclear energy. So I wonder if you might talk about both those developments, AI on the one hand, nuclear on the other.
AI is pretty worrying for those of us like Catherine that probably follow energy consumption trends. It's starting to strain the US grid. I've seen some projections that are from the industry, so you have to take them with a grain of salt, that say that by mid-century, so 2050, we could see 10% of global electricity use going to AI, training of large language models, data center consumption, and so forth. 10% is a huge number. That'd be like bigger than most countries, bigger than everyone except for maybe China and the United States. And so we are on kind of this pathway of massive increased consumption. It's also totally changed energy projections, because 10 years ago, we were kind of like demand is going to flatten in the US. And now everyone is talking about unexpected increases in electricity demand, even to the point where Microsoft is talking about building small modular nuclear reactors and so forth. Which leads me to my second point about nuclear power. I'm very skeptical of it. I think it's a very top-down, centralized, risky approach that has issues of nuclear waste, issues of accidents, issues of cost overruns, issues of uranium mining, issues of decommissioning, and then long-lived radioactive waste. We still don't have a permanent geologic repository, despite the fact that we're supposed to have one since 1982. So I'm with Amory Lovins, a good colleague of mine, do energy efficiency. and new renewables before you even worry about nuclear. It went from too cheap to meter to too costly to matter.
Sister Catherine?
Next question, how could our universities further develop academic programs that integrate universities and communities from other universities around the world, especially the Southern Hemisphere? Global awareness and solidarity are key to the care for our common home. Are you seeing opportunities that are emerging in the work you're doing?
I think that's probably for Nancy, right? And Nancy, I'm going to piggyback on it. So sorry, Sister Catherine, but there was one more that I thought we should just throw on top of that one. So, a lot of schools face fiscal constraints. So what are some good, relatively low cost ethics projects that you could do at a college or university that, might go some way toward climate action? So those two questions, sorry, that's kind of a big piggyback.
That's great. I like the concept of universities collaborating with the global South. And part of it ties back to the conversation that we just had about, needing a moral conversion. Our work with the global South, especially South America and Central America and Latin America, is that for those countries, this is all about, the ethics and the morality and the relationality, just like it is with indigenous people. It's about the relationship that people have with nature and people have with, what we call natural resources. So working with the global South, I think, is something that we North Americans could learn from. The way that they approach these issues is not just technical and transactional, but it's relational, and it's about what gives people hope and what fulfills them. And it's just certainly much more on a moral and ethical basis than the way that we tend to solve problems in the US, which is, very data-driven and very transactional. You asked about the fiscal constraints. Okay, I will simply argue that the return on investment is enormous, and everybody balks at how much the upfront cost is to put in geothermal or solar panels or any kind of technological solution that we have. But the return on investment, and especially for universities where buildings have a lifespan of 40 or 50 years before we tear a building down and replace it, it is a terrific investment financially. And if you can't show your president those numbers and convince them that this is the way to go. You mentioned, Bernard, that maybe people could do projects that are kind of more based on, environmental justice. And certainly those are a way to move sort of the culture forward in thinking more intentionally about choices that we make. There's just a lot of low-hanging fruit that universities can do that doesn't really require much money. It requires work, coordination, and behavioral change. It requires us to quit printing on paper, to make policies that we don't buy any more printers. It's stuff like that is a behavioral change, and we're always reluctant to give up what is a luxury. We want it to be convenient. We want to do the easy way. We don't have to want to change. So, Ben mentioned we can change in 30 seconds and, but we don't really want to, do we? We kind of want to hold on to it. I'd rather, take an elevator up 3 stories than walk because it's more convenient and I feel lazy. Those are the barriers that they're stupid and they're small, but they do add up, like Catherine said, every little action that we take matters.
And I would add too, I just want to be clear, because we are coming at this from a place of enormous privilege. For many people, making the right choice is more expensive, in some cases prohibitively more expensive and more difficult than making the wrong choice. So for example, I don't know if anybody's ever lived in a food desert, but I have lived in a food desert without a car. The only vegetable I could get at the grocery store I walked to was iceberg lettuce. So what we need to do is those of us who have the ability to change the way we live have the responsibility to make those changes, but not to stop there, because we need the best and the most affordable choices for everyone to also be the best choices for the planet as well. We need public transportation to be freely available and faster than a car. If it's not available, we need charging stations to be easier to find and more affordable to use than gas stations. We need, fresh fruits and vegetables to be easily available and accessible to people and affordable too. So that's why our voices are so important, is because we have to change the system so that the default, no-brainer, cheapest, easiest thing for everybody to do is also the best choice, which unfortunately today is exactly the opposite. Often the $2 hamburger, which is $2 because they cut down the Amazon to grow the cows, is cheaper than fresh vegetables and fresh fruit or some other type of healthy protein. So that, I think, is a really important perspective, because when we only focus like this on what we can do, we ignore the fact that a lot of people cannot make these changes. And so at our universities, for example, I just love how I've seen universities using waste food and making it available to students who can't afford to eat regularly as well as they could. I love universities that are asking all the students across the whole university to take climate classes. At the University of Barcelona, the students actually protested and had a sit-in until the university agreed that every student should take a climate course. At UC San Diego, thankfully, the administration was already in on that, so all students there are doing it, as at Dickinson College and many others. There's so much that universities can do to make the big red easy button of climate action the default for everyone. And once you've had those 4 years of it being the default, it gives you that ability to take that throughout your life and to notice when it isn't. And when it isn't, that's when we need structural change, and that's when our voices are so important.
Great, thank you. I have 3 more questions. We have 4 minutes. So 2 of the questions too will be for all 3 of you, and Sister Catherine might have more questions too. But this question, a number of people ask about planetary boundaries and tipping points. That concept has been raised. I heard several of you, I think, talk about tipping points. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
One person asked a little while ago, and I put a link in the Q&A. So if you go to the answered questions, there's a link to a talk by Johan Rockström, who's the scientist who introduced the concept of planetary boundaries. And the idea is that when we unsustainably consume the resources of this planet, not only unsustainably, but inequitably, because remember, the richest 1% produce twice the carbon as the poorest 50%. And not to mention all of the food and land and other resources and energy. So when we unsustainably and inequitably use our resources, we are using more than a round planet can sustain. We're acting as if the planet is infinite and flat, but it isn't. It's round and finite with 8 billion people on it. So planetary boundaries is the concept of we have to live within our boundaries. We have to live on a round planet. I mean, that sounds like a shocking news flash, doesn't it? But we aren't living as if the planet was round. We are still living as if it were flat and infinite in the year 2025. So that's the concept of the planetary boundaries. And then we know that the further we push the planet, the greater the risk of tipping points where the climate system transitions to a different state that we can't easily go back from. But we also know that there are social tipping points. Social tipping points in electric car purchases, social tipping points in making the moral case for climate action, social tipping points in terms of making the default big red easy button the right thing to do rather than the wrong thing. And so as there's physical tipping points in the climate system pushing us the wrong way, all the more reason to lean into the social tipping points that will push us the right way, that begin with each of us as individuals using our voice to share what we're doing ourselves, what our school is doing, what our place of work is doing, what our city is doing, and what we could all do together to help move us in the right direction rather than the wrong one.
Thank you. Sister Catherine?
Maybe we'll end with this question. The focus of our conversations and this serial conference is really looking at horizons of hope and envisioning a livable future. I would ask each panelist to comment, where do you envision positive change, and what gives you hope in the work that you're doing and what you see in terms of the challenges before us?
That pause is too
Yeah,
long.
geez.
Too long, Ben. Gosh.
I didn't know I was going first, but I, going to my own presentation, remain hopeful about both technology innovation and collective action by individuals and consumers. And you may be surprised that already the energy efficiency improvements we've made since the 1973 energy crisis have saved more energy than all sources of supply today. And that's not new high-tech stuff. It's simple stuff like inflating our tires and doing fuel economy standards and labeling our appliances and consuming less and just being smarter. So I think this notion that we have to invent new technologies to get our way out of this mess is wrong. We have everything we need right now. We just have to act differently.
And I'll jump in and just say that, the technologies are there, and that is hopeful. It seems to be a social barrier, and the social barrier gets deeper. It digs in deeper and deeper with each passing year. However, I see in the circles that I hang out with so many people that are so motivated and know what to do and are doing it. It's not that everybody's sitting around saying, well, I just don't know what to do. There are so many people that are mobilized and really putting their concerns into action. That's what gives me hope. And frankly, that's what gives youth hope. They don't want us to say, oh, we're so glad that this new generation understands climate change. They're going to help us to get out of here. There isn't enough time to wait for them to grow up and, have a job and have influence and have money. We're the ones that have to do this and lead by example. And that's what gives the youth hope, is when we mobilize.
I completely agree. What you both said reminded me of something that Greta Thunberg said, which is the one thing we need more than hope is action, because once we act, hope is all around us. Hope is not an emotion, hope is a practice. And I practice hope every day. I practice it by going out and looking for information on people that are making a difference. And then I share it with other people. That's why I do my weekly newsletter, Talking Climate. It's my own practice of hope, my own discipline of hope. And hope is just the understanding that if we act, we will make a difference. And the science firmly agrees with that. If we act, everything we do makes a difference. And the more we realize that we're not alone, that giant boulder of climate action is actually rolling down the hill and it's got millions of hands on it already, the more we realize that we truly can make a difference. So there's a famous quote on hope that's attributed to St. Augustine, but I don't think he actually wrote it. But I still love the quote, so I'll just end with that. It says, "Hope has two beautiful daughters. Their names are anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to see that they do not remain as they are."
Thank you very much. I think that's an appropriate point with which to end. So again, this is our first of 7 events. The next event is on February 17. It has to do with the contribution of Catholic social thought, in particular the question, what are or ought to be the growing edges of the tradition? There are several questions in the Q&A about retirement, investment, finance, the economy. We're going to be addressing all those topics in further events. So thanks to our audience for joining us. Sister Catherine, thanks for your collaboration.
Thank
And
you.
thanks, yeah, and thanks to our outstanding panelists. Really, really appreciate that. Sister Catherine, did you have another word?
No, we just hope to see you all at our next event, and stay tuned for the recording link that will be shared out after it's processed in a day or two.
Okay, thanks everybody. Have a good night. Take care.